So far, our goal is to kind of figure out what makes the colonists so angry that they're willing to go to war with England. And we're kind of building our building blocks. And it all starts at the end of the French and Indian War in 1763. Obviously, they need to pay taxes for the war and the governor gets more authority. But we also know that Parliament puts this law into place, the Proclamation of 1763, saying that the colonists who just fought to help England win the French and Indian War is not allowed to use the land they just won, the Ohio River Valley. To make matters worse, the very next year, in 1764, Parliament adds a new law, a tax on all imports, things shipped into the colonies. This one was called the Sugar Act. And then the very next year, in 1765, Parliament adds a new law. This time it's a tax on anything printed on paper. That one's called the Stamp Act. Now, at this point, some of our colonists are just getting so angry and they feel that they have no choice but to protest. And so we talked about some of the different ways that the colonists protested, some violent, some nonviolent. We know that some colonists chose to write letters or petitions to Parliament to express how frustrated they were with some of these rules and laws. We also talked about how easy it was to kind of ignore those letters and petitions. They decided it was a lot harder to ignore a person, so they decided to send their very, very trusted colonist, Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin is from our very own Philadelphia, the colony of Pennsylvania. And they sent him in person to England to speak to Parliament and let Parliament know face to face just how the colonists are feeling. And again, Ben Franklin, from right here in Pennsylvania, from the city of Philadelphia, was an inventor, a scientist, a writer. He was a printer. He owned a print shop where they printed the newspaper called the Pennsylvania Gazette. He was a politician and eventually, after the war, becomes a founding father of our country and helps turn our country into what it is today. He invented the lightning rod, bifocal glasses, and even the Franklin stove. He had a hand in starting the first fire department and the first public library, probably most well known for his experiment with electricity and the key and the kite. But in the episode of Liberty's Kids that you watch today, you will see Ben Franklin in England speaking to Parliament. And of course, he's committing the crime of treason just by telling Parliament that he does not like and believe in their rules and laws. We'll see how Parliament reacts to Ben Franklin. We also talked about the fact that some colonists boycotted or refused to buy the things that would require them to pay taxes to the king in hopes that that would send a message to the king. We also talked about the fact that all throughout the colonies, colonists became parts of secret groups that would kind of talk about what they could do to deal with these unfair rules and laws. We talked about the fact that the most famous and well-known secret group in all the colonies was the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty were from the city of Boston. And the reason that the Sons of Liberty are pretty much the most famous or well-known secret group is because some of the things that they chose to do in response to how they felt about the unfair rules and laws became major events in history, major events that helped to lead to the Revolutionary War. We also talked about the fact that some colonists behaved violently in protest of these rules and laws. And obviously their anger was at the king and Parliament, but they were 3,000 miles away. A lot of times this violence was targeted at the governor, maybe the tax collectors like Andrew Oliver that we talked about, and even fellow colonists that were grateful and remain loyal to the king are loyalists. And so we talked about the fact that, obviously king and Parliament are going to find out about how the colonists are protesting over in the colonies. And when we made a prediction of what we thought they would do when they heard about all of this protesting, some of you guys thought, well, if they hear that the colonists are protesting, well, then they'll add even more rules and laws. Some of you thought they would just ignore the protests. I think Parliament surprised us all when we learned that Parliament ended up removing the Stamp Act. The vocabulary word for removing a law is to repeal a law. This is awesome. Parliament listened. Boston, the richest guy in Boston, John Hancock, member of the Sons of Liberty secret group, celebrated Parliament repealing or removing the Stamp Act by setting off fireworks in the streets of Boston. In New York City, if you remember, they put up a 4,000-pound metal statue of KG3 to say thank you so much for this. Remember that statue. It'll play a role in a later story. We know as soon as things start to look great, a big butt sneaks in. Although Parliament chose to repeal the Stamp Act, they quickly replaced the Stamp Act with a new law. This law was called the Townshend Act. And basically, I get why KG3 and Parliament put this law into place. Our cities, like Boston, were out of control. They were tar and feathering loyalists. They were attacking the tax collectors. They were even destroying the home of the governor. And so the king and parliament realized they needed to send soldiers to kind of get everything under control. So the Townshend Act sent 9,000 soldiers, 9,000 troops into rowdy cities, cities like Boston. And the Townshend Acts also added a few more taxes. So this is going to lead directly to the next major event in our story. Think about Boston right now. We know we have angry colonists. Now we're adding, because of the Townshend Acts, soldiers with guns. Angry colonists plus soldiers with guns. That is a recipe for disaster. And that will lead directly to the event that is known as the Boston Massacre. You are seeing this very lovely kind of old looking picture here. This is kind of an image of what Boston may have looked like back in 1770, the time when this event took place. Now, the Boston Massacre, I connected with the number 5. It is 5 years before the war starts. The Revolutionary War will start in 1775. The Boston Massacre happens in 1770. So we're 5 years before the war starts. It happens on March 5th, 1770, the number 5 again. But the main important thing to realize that is connected to the number 5, that at the end of this day, March 5th, 1770, 5 colonists will end up dead. So I am going to, on the next slide, have you watch a short clip about the events that take place on March 5th, 1770, 5 years before the war starts, where 5 colonists end up dead. Then you will watch another video by me that will talk about how that event, the Boston Massacre, changes history forever.